Welcome to Faith Works Live. Here's your host, Rebecca Haynie.
You're listening to Faith Works Live, and it's my joy to be with you. We get to talk about the truth. We like to walk in the light as he is in the light. That's always our goal. What does that look like in the 21st century when the entire world seems to have suddenly and collectively and exuberantly lost their minds? Well, that's what we explore here on our hour of airtime in this little slice of eternity. And I always appreciate guests that make me think, that challenge me. And I am honored to be joined by one of those right now. Mary Harrington is our guest, and she has an incredible personal story, but she follows a plethora of topics. In particular, what on earth is going on in the culture and the politics with the devaluing of women, the devaluing of humanity in general, and this idea of transhumanism, which I'll have her define. She is a former liberal feminist. That's how she defines herself, and she considers herself a reactionary feminist. She's a contributing weekly editor at Unheard, born in the UK, graduated from Oxford, and she's a skilled writer. You've probably seen her name before: First Things, The New York Post, Spectator, Times of London, and you can check out her weekly Substack as well, Reactionary Feminist on Culture and Politics in the Cyborg Era. Mary Harrington, it's our pleasure for you to join our program. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I wonder if a good place to start might not be how on earth you end up in this beat and some of your personal backstory. Now, I would say as a woman, I care deeply about the way our society is devaluing women and seems to be so incredibly confused about such basic things, especially when we've been proclaiming women's rights, for over 3 generations now, that there should be something special and something honored about being a woman, that we should be proud of that we should have equality on that basis. And yet now, even the best minds of our generation seem to have trouble defining what a woman is. We'll talk about how we got here and how it's the farthest thing from progressive. But what interests you in all of these subjects?
I got here the hard way by buying in about as fully as it's possible to buy into the other way of looking at things. I guess I was an early adopter of the woke worldview. That's probably the neatest way of putting it. I went all the way down the critical theory rabbit hole at university 20 years ago, when it was still kind of a bolt-on rather than having kind of eaten the whole academy as it is now. So it was still an optional thing you could do aside from English literature, which I read. But I got very into it, and it fried my brain, and I did my best to take it seriously, and it left me very adrift in my 20s. I guess the very short version of a very long story is that if you try and apply those precepts literally, and you try and lead your life as though nothing can be certain, no communication can ever be authentic, and no encounter can ever be authentic, and nothing is really true or real, which is the takeaway. I mean, I'm being very reductive, but that was my takeaway from all of that. Then it leaves you in a very unstable, impermanent, lonely, very, very liberated. Genuinely, it's very liberating, but liberating not just from some things which might have felt restraining, but also from some things which are actually deeply comforting, like being able to trust other people, which is kind of fundamental. Anyway, long story short, it all kind of fell apart for me at once. During the great crash of 2008, my business fell apart, my home situation fell apart. Recovering from all of that left me questioning everything which I tried to take seriously up to that point. I also, my grandmother, who's no longer with us, but shortly before that, she gave me some advice which kind of stuck with me. She said it in a very grandma-ish way. She said, "I think you should grow your hair and get married." Is what she said, and it was a very grandma-ish way of saying, "Have you tried being normal?" And
That's
actually,
wonderful.
have you tried? I mean, that's essentially what she was having. Have a go at being normal, Mary. It really isn't that bad. And actually, it was excellent advice. And I decided to have a go at being normal. And it turned out there's a lot to be said for a lot of aspects of all the things which I'd internalized were sort of bad and terrible and oppressive and patriarchal. Turned out from the inside not to be that at all. Long story short, about 7 years later, I sort of reassembled something like a workable worldview, and come to the conclusion that not everything is the exact opposite from what I believed it was before, but quite a lot of it was maybe not quite a lot of the things I'd believed before weren't true. And the central one of those was I just no longer believed in progress. I no longer believed in this, I suppose, sort of broadly left liberal idea that things in this world are on a trajectory from more bad to less bad, and that can carry on indefinitely, and that and that progress basically means more freedom and more freedom and more money and more stuff, I think is basically the gist of it. And that this is all somehow attainable in this life, and we can go on going up that arc forever. I came to the conclusion that was a belief, it wasn't a fact. And I just didn't really believe it anymore. And that left me with a bit of a problem, because it wasn't as though just because I kind of checked out of the whole left liberal worldview, I hadn't checked out of the whole left liberal worldview, in the sense that I hadn't stopped being a feminist, in the sense that I hadn't stopped caring about women's interests. You don't have to. I mean, anybody with eyes and a functioning brain can see that women's interests are sometimes sidelined, sure, irrespective of what side of the political aisle you fall or your faith background. You can see that the interests of men and women are not always identical. And sometimes women can find themselves shouted down. And I also came to think that a lot of the liberal feminist articles of faith were not necessarily actually in women's interest, to cut a very long story very short. And this was really concretized for me by the experience of having a child and realizing that there's a colossal blind spot, a colossal motherhood-shaped blind spot in liberal feminism. And as I set about trying to make sense of that, being the theory nerd that I am, thinking, why is this? Why is it that a whole ideology which is committed to the advancement of women's interests cannot see mothers? Surely this is one of the defining characteristics of women, right? Why is it that this ideology only addresses the interests of mothers in the sense of trying to liberate us from our children? What about those women who don't want to be quite so liberated from their kids? And that started me down several more rabbit holes. First, it started me looking at the early history of feminism, which is very much written out of the picture in modern sort of magazine feminism, if you like. I discovered there's this whole incredibly rich 19th century, very, very noble tradition of thinking and arguing about women's interests, which comes from what I suppose now reads as a much more conservative perspective. There's this whole body of literature which has basically been cancelled from the history of feminism because it's problematic in all sorts of ways from the modern work perspective. There's the so-called cult of domesticity, which to me reads as a straightforward form of feminism, which was a huge body of women's writing in the 19th century, which was dedicated to making the case for motherhood and the home. Which to me reads straightforwardly as a form of feminism, but it's illegible from a modern context in that way. So I set out thinking, why is this? How did we get here? How did we get to the point where what calls itself feminism is missing half of the picture? What's going on here? And as I thought about it, I came to see that what we call feminism it's not so much evidence of progress in an abstract sense, because I just don't believe in progress. I don't think it's a thing. Not in this life anyway. If instead we think of it as women's response to the way that men and women's lives together were transformed over the course of industrialization and into the modern world, then we can see the different arguments within feminism begin to make sense. Because on the one hand, you've got a bunch of women who are doing their best to make sense of actually a much reduced economic role as bourgeois housewives rather than economically active women in a productive agrarian household. It was a huge transformation. Because work left the household, right? And where women had always worked, as farmers' wives, which is obviously, as much an active and productive role as being a farmer. You're just doing different work,
certainly,
but you're working. It was only really with the emergence of the bourgeois housewife that women became this sort of chief consumer in a private household. And so actually under those circumstances, they lost agency. And the cult of domesticity was women's response to that and saying, no, actually, what we're doing still matters. Even if we're not the ones earning the money, we're creating a domestic space, we're educating children, we're doing all of these other civic activities, what we do is still important. Mm-hmm. But then there's the whole other group of women who are saying, well, this is all fine, but what happens if your husband beats you and you can't own property? Or what happens if your husband is a drunk? What happens if your husband abandons you? And, we can't own property and we can't really do anything. And if we want to leave an abusive husband, we have to leave our kids behind. Mm-hmm. And so those women were saying, well, actually, what we need is to enter the market on the same terms as men. And so they sort of took the opposite side of this very new argument, which was triggered by the transition from one form of society into really the modern, more high-tech market society that we're just familiar with now as just the modern world. And they took two sides of that. And the whole pre-1960s history of feminism is about this back and forth between what I think of as the feminism of freedom and the feminism of care, which is this incredibly rich and thoughtful debate between women across classes as well, because women are responding to different material circumstances about how do we get to grips with what it means to be women's reproductive role and women's particular obligations as mothers in that context, and our vulnerabilities, we're smaller and weaker and we can become pregnant and so on. How do we respond to the way the world has changed?
Mm-hmm.
And in Feminism Against Progress, what I've argued is that we no longer live in that era. We've left that era behind. And what's tipped us into the new era, which is where we get to transhumanism. I've called this new era the cyborg era, but you could also call it the transhumanist era. And the transhumanist era was precipitated by another tech transition, which really focused on women's bodies. That was the arrival of birth control, and logically after that of legal abortion. Because that tipped the scales definitively, where previously our reproductive biology was just non-negotiable, right? And so on the one hand, there were women arguing for freedom, and on the other hand, there were women arguing for care. But nobody was really arguing over the ontology of our reproductive role. Nobody was arguing over whether or not we had to have babies, because that's just what women were.
Sure.
And all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a situation where we actually can flatten those differences, or so it seems. We can take a pill that means we can have sex like men. In theory, we can do what men do and there are no consequences. And so the entire edifice of moral governance on how the sexes interacted with one another fell away abruptly. And it was experienced as very liberating, very emancipating. But with that also came inescapably the entry of commerce, of the market effectively, into areas of our intimate lives which had previously been governed by social rules. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, along with the freedom to do what you want with your own body, it comes the freedom to buy or sell your own body. Inescapably, if you privatize something, in theory, you can dispose of it as you see fit. So if I privatize my sexuality and it's no longer governed by society, then that means, in theory, if what I do with my own body is my own business, then that it opens the door for libertarian defenses of pornography and libertarian defenses of the sex industry. And so it's no coincidence that there was a boom in the sex industry and the boom in the porn industry directly downstream of the arrival of the contraceptive pill. Because the two things are inextricable. Mm-hmm. The moment something is privatized, it can be opened up to commerce. It can be opened up to commodification. And the 1960s feminist utopians didn't see this. They thought we could have the freedom without the trade. And they were out protesting against the degrading impacts of pornography. But, you would have prized the pill out of their cold, dead hands. Mm-hmm. And they didn't realize that the two things were really impossible to separate from one another. And where this connects to transhumanism is that my contention is that the pill was the first transhumanist technology, in the sense that it set out not to fix something that was wrong with our normal physiology, but to fix normal physiology in the interests of freedom. So up to that point, we'd had a common image of what human health looks like, whether, for men and for women, and, doctors would be able to tell you perfectly well what a normal human physiology looks like. They'd be able to draw and describe normal, healthy functioning. And I think the contraceptive pill is the first mass adoption technology which sets out to break that. That's its purpose. Or rather to upgrade it. And it opens a whole new paradigm for medicine where instead of setting out to repair something that's gone wrong, whether it's a broken leg or, there's something wrong with my kidney or whatever's gone wrong with me, I can go to the doctor and say, here, please fix this. Now I'm saying, here, there's something about me that I don't like. Can I just upgrade it so it's better? And once we've accepted in principle that it's perfectly legitimate to do that to women's reproductive systems, then it's very difficult to argue, to make the case for why I shouldn't have extra limbs grafted. I mean, in a sense, that's just a difference of degree rather than a difference in kind. So I've set out to trace the direct line that follows from the entry into transhumanism with the mass adoption of the contraceptive pill through to the very much more explicitly transhumanist paradigm, which is now being rolled out across the culture in general, really accelerated by the arrival of the digital revolution with the mainstreaming of gender ideology. Mm-hmm. And to show that actually this isn't something which has come out of nowhere. This has been brewing for 50 years now. It's been rapidly accelerated by the digital revolution. But we shouldn't stand here and think, well, hang on, where has this come from? Because in fact, it's half a century old.
Mm. Well, I'm so glad that you mentioned that and that you're laying out the timeline so well and helping us make these connections, Mary, because it does feel to many of us in the world at large that it's almost been inspired by TikTok in a way, that we have just a generation of people who are crafting new pronouns for themselves just because it's Tuesday, not to reduce people who have legitimate gender dysphoria, but just the rapid onset version of it seems to have taken the entire culture by storm. When you have major companies now that have overlooked, women's issues in general, other than maybe a slogan and march for, their own political purposes that are now crawling over broken glass to find impersonators of women, men who believe that they are women, to set up multi-million-dollar marketing deals so that they can be influencers for their product for 45 seconds. Here in America, we have a woman that sits on the United States Supreme Court that cannot, under oath, define what a woman even is. And how on earth can we celebrate her achievements as a woman if we don't even know what that is? But yet we're also willing to enter into the lexicon degrading monikers like birthing persons or womb carriers or chest feeding, which is a personal pet peeve of mine. That's utterly ridiculous. We do see this as almost like a tornado that came up out of nowhere, that came up without any sort of warning and is washing over us. And we don't really know how to respond to it as average people. But as you lay out in your research in your book, Feminism Against Progress, this didn't come out of nowhere. It does follow logically if you can pick up on the breadcrumbs that you're laying out for us, because we have divorced ourselves. We have untethered ourselves from actual definitions of objective truth, of how we were designed, of our purposes, of our distinctions, being male and female. And both of those things are wonderful and equal in value and part of the Imago Dei. But we do have different roles and we have different challenges. We were always designed, I believe, to work together like two sides of the coin. When you devalue and deface one, you devalue and deface the other. But can you help make some more of these connections? Because I find all of this extremely fascinating between feminism, I would say the failures of feminism here to reject maybe the dignity or the roles that are specific to women or to redefine womanhood. And now what we're seeing where a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man, and none of these things have meaning. And we're celebrating all of this as though it's this grand victory for human rights, when in actuality, it is depriving women. It's taking us backward as far as some of those victories for equality that we thought feminism had earned us.
Well, I suppose one point that I would pick up on there, that doesn't really get pointed out enough, or at least unfortunately it only gets pointed out by misogynists, and that's to a significant extent what's going on here is a fight within feminism. And it's a fight which is heavily inflected by social class. Let me explain what I mean by that a little bit more. Is a Supreme Court justice, I believe you said, who doesn't know refuses to define woman.
Yes.
Now, if you think
Ketanji Brown Jackson.
That's right. Name. That's right. Didn't you say I'm not a biologist?
Yes.
You think, wait, what? Wait, what? but really, if you think about life as let's say you're an ambitious, hardworking, high-achieving woman, you've been to an Ivy League college, you've worked hard at your career, your professional life involves being in front of a laptop in some way or other. Maybe you don't have kids, you get Ubered from place to place. It's not as though your life is an arduous one. In theory, from where you're sitting, especially if you went to an all-girls school, especially if you don't have brothers, especially if there wasn't much roughhousing at school, you would struggle to see why there is any meaningful difference between male and female people. And you might also, somewhere in the back of your mind, be thinking, well, I don't really like when people say, no, actually, male and female, he created us, but we have different roles. Because does that mean my role doesn't include being a Supreme Court justice? Mm-hmm. What if somebody suggests that, in fact, those differences aren't just below the neck, but also above the neck? And what's that going to mean for my professional prospects? And really what the point I want to make is that it's for high-achieving, professional class, laptop class women, it is in their class interests to abolish biological sex, broadly legally. It is broadly in their class interests for there to be no social or cultural recognition that male and female are distinct or have any political relevance, that they ever matter. Because from where you're sitting, they kind of don't. However, it's a very different ballgame if you're a working class woman. I mean, if you look at the people who collect your trash once a week, I'll bet money on what sex they are. It's arduous work. The people who work on oil rigs tend not to be women. There are no angry feminist campaigns for more female trash collectors because everybody knows it's low status, arduous work.
True. And
you need to have a certain build to be able to withstand it. But then, of course, there are crunch points, because while nobody really cares that the trash collectors are all men, once you start getting into contested areas where biological sex can either be acknowledged as such or abolished, you start to find that the Supreme Court justices and people like that will want to roll out their belief system even in places where it's obviously grossly unjust, such as teenage sports athletics competitions or indeed women's prisons. Mm-hmm. And once you start saying, no, actually biological sex doesn't matter, because it never matters. And in fact, anybody who says they're a woman should be incarcerated in a female prison, then you're going to have to look away when prisoners start being impregnated or raped or sexually assaulted in prison. And really what you're seeing there, and what that picture is some extremely upper class women pursuing their class interests over the backs of pretty much the most unfortunate and vulnerable women in society. Which is something which I, as you can imagine, as a feminist, get pretty angry about. As a basic matter of social justice and decency, it's something that I think all of us should be angry about. But what's going on there is it's the most grotesque perversion of social justice. But the reason it's happening, and the reason there are people who are telling you with a straight face that it's feminist, that this policy should be pursued, is because from a certain very narrow class perspective, it genuinely is feminist. And these are just externalities that they don't care about. So that's really probably the most important thread I'd pull out, and it's one really to underline the question which I think doesn't get addressed often enough, which is that why are these men who say they're women, why are the loudest supporters of that group almost always women? And this
that's
I think
an excellent question. How would you answer it?
Well, for the same reason as Justice Ketanji Brown refuses to define woman. It's not in her interests for woman to be defined because it might be used to constrain her agency. And there's a very large subset of well-educated, ambitious women who don't want woman to be defined because they worry that they might be confined by that definition. And therefore, they're happy to expand the definition of women, even to the point of rendering it completely meaningless at the expense of a great many women for whom that definition still has meaning and legal importance and political salience. And they're just happy to see those interests blown out of the water because it remains in their interest to make the definition so expansive in order to ensure their freedom.
It's sad but true. It's an equality for me, but not for thee, if I could reduce it down to a quick 10-word slogan. Mary Harrington is our guest and phenomenal writer. She has written the book called Feminism Against Progress, some of the content that we're discussing today, but we will only be able to scratch the surface of the necessary insights in today's program. So I invite you to get your own copy and follow along, won't you? As we slouch toward Gomorrah, as we continue to look at the lies under the guise of freedom and progress that have led us here today, where we are, politely put, incredibly confused and trending towards chaos with every passing day, it seems. And yet, I believe there is hope. And we'll get into that perhaps on the other side with Mary. I'm going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll talk a bit more about why we are so confused, the devaluing of marriage, again, the redefinition of what gender even means and gender fluidity, the rise in surrogacy, I find quite fascinating, and what it really means to be a part of a transhumanist era and where the hope might lie. Is there a coming backlash, perhaps? Are people waking up to the damage that some of these lies have done? I believe there is hope, and we'll see what Mary thinks about that when we return. You're listening to FaithWorks Live. Hey, what's for dinner? If you're like me, I hear that 15 times a day. And fortunately, I have a plan. It's typically Animus beef at our house. We are such big fans of Animus beef at the Haynie home because it's just great quality beef. There's no steroids or antibiotics. It's naturally raised butcher beef. They sell by the quarter, the half, or the whole, and they support your local meat lockers so they can help you get it processed in a way that works for you. In this economy, it's good to have affordable options for your meat. And if you're willing to make a good investment in your nutrition for a healthy menu plan, I highly recommend Animus Beef. Contact Dave and Mary Lynn at animusbeef.com. They welcome your questions. They'll help get you on the schedule. They have locker dates coming up. Don't wait. Secure your locker date today. Go to animusbeef.com. That's OHNEMUS beef.com. There's no better time than now to stand for life. And you can stand with Iowa's original pro-life organization, Pulse for Life. They're the longest standing nonprofit pro-life organization in Iowa, and they are dedicated to informing, educating, and inspiring a new generation to value the sanctity of all human life, from fertilization until natural death. They serve at the State House. They educate in classrooms, at events. They proudly serve on the coalition of pro-life leaders. They are on the front lines of of the battle against this throwaway culture of death that we see all around us, and we are winning ground. Hearts and minds are changing, and the pro-life movement is continuing to grow. And you can be a part of the exciting things that are happening right here in our own backyard at pulseforlife.org and get your finger on the pro-life pulse. Sign up for their newsletter, find ways that you can make a difference and how you can change hearts and minds with their pro-life apologetics course, pulseforlife.org. I'm so glad you've joined us here on Faith Works Live. It's a special day. Mary Harrington is our esteemed guest today. She's a former liberal feminist and is a firm believer in feminism from one perspective. She calls herself a reactionary feminist. She is a weekly editor at Unheard, contributing weekly editor there. Check out her Substack, Reactionary Feminist. She writes on a wonderful variety of things. Sometimes the news isn't always good, but her insights always are. So check out her work. I highly recommend it. And the book that we're discussing today is an in-depth look at feminism, and in particular, some of the ways that feminism has been against progress. In fact, that's the title, Feminism Against Progress, the Deceit of 21st Century Women's Liberation. And Mary, I wonder if you have seen, as I have, more of a backlash lately against the term feminism. It seems that fewer and fewer women are comfortable defining themselves as a feminist. And I have to assume that it's because of, your writing. Perhaps you're single-handedly creating this wake-up call. But it's also the attacking of women, like when women are undermining their own efforts, as you mentioned, in a contradictory way, although you point out the consistency. So let me not speak out of turn here, but it does seem contradictory that you have very high-profile women, such as J.K. Rowling, who are saying, no, the definition of woman actually does mean something. And she's coming from a quite liberal perspective. And she is being tarred and feathered online and, God forbid, literally, just for asserting that there is such a thing as a woman and that a man is something different entirely, and that someone who calls himself a woman, has biology to contend with. It's not up for redefinition because of her dyed-in-the-wool feminist credentials there. And I think women are looking at that in combination with the devaluing of motherhood and feeling like they've pursued their career and they wind up empty at 30, 35. They look around and they think this isn't as fulfilling as I thought it might be. And the empty promises that feminism failed to deliver for them personally. And I'm seeing fewer and fewer women actually identify with the notion of feminism or the values of feminism. And is that true is that what you're seeing as well?
Well, I think the situation in Britain is very slightly different to in the United States. There's a strong and vigorous, I guess, radical feminist, well, as in left-wing radical feminist movement to resisting gender ideology in the United Kingdom, and I believe it's much more coming from the right in the US, the resistance to gender ideology. So those are politically two very slightly different situations, although there's certainly overlap. Where it comes to, I think it's definitely the case that younger women are often very ambivalent about the term feminism, because I think in a lot of cases, because they see it as having been taken over by people who are just frankly quite annoying and cringe, and just basically wrong about a lot of stuff. And they think, well, why would I want to be one of these people? So there are definitely subcultures of young women who've just rejected the entire picture out of hand. Actually, a lot of those women end up, I guess, kind of in my corner, in my, the reactionary feminist corner, which is to say, it's not so much that I argue that feminism has been against progress as that feminism should be against progress. That's very much my stance.
I see.
When I describe myself as a reactionary feminist, it's because I think women's progress is not in women's interests anymore, in the sense of using technology to buy us more freedom at the cost of making us more viable and sellable. I think that's very obviously not in women's interests, because why would I want to spend even more time away from my kids in order to do whatever job I don't even particularly like? Really, what started me thinking about all of this is that is looking, well, having a child and realizing that there was nothing. I sucked at every job I ever did before I fell into writing. Which was pretty relatively late in life. I was about 40 when I started, when I fell into journalism by mistake. And up to that point, I'd been terrible at every job that I'd ever attempted. Just absolutely sucked. And after I had my daughter, there was literally nothing I could imagine wanting to do professionally that I'd done hitherto that I wanted to do more than be around her. And that left me, I guess, unusually for a woman of my class, and you would think job prospects, in having a lot of sympathy for those women who have jobs rather than careers, which is to say, more broadly speaking, not so middle class women, women whose professional prospects might be putting packets through a scanner, or or baking coffee or whatever, all of which are noble and honorable occupations and perfectly decent ways to make a living. But you might not necessarily feel very liberated by doing that, by having to park your kid in daycare for 12 hours a day in order to go and put packets through a scanner. So when I see women making the case that being liberated to go and work is by definition always good for everybody, I think, well, you're actually missing out. Surely a solid sort of 60% of the women who might actually take a different view and want a different balance, and that's what started me thinking along those lines. But when I look deeper into it, I realize that actually it starts, the descent from feminism and the asking of questions is coming younger and younger, because I see younger and younger women really very bruised and very broken by the quote unquote sex positive culture, which again began with the contraceptive pill, but which has been rapidly accelerated by online dating and really by the internet in general, and the subcultures which emerge, the pervasive pornography on the internet, and the subcultures that emerge in dark corners of the internet. I see younger and younger women who've reached their early 20s and have started and are saying, at a very young age, you put me on the pill when I was 14 or whatever. You didn't even explain to me what it was going to do to my psychic makeup and to my physiology. Right. And that left me in a position where I had no real reason to say no to X, Y, and Z. And I've been emotionally and spiritually, and in some cases physically injured by the acts that I said yes to, because nobody told me that there was any reason not to. And in fact, they called it sex positivity. And here I am feeling brutalized and run through, and I'm not 22 yet, and how am I ever supposed to find some kind of meaningful relationship and connection when that's actually what I want more than anything in the world? So really, far more profoundly and far more painfully than even the question about who's liberated by taking women away from our bodies, is the question of who gains. Who gains from having neutered women and turned sex into a casual leisure activity? And I see a lot of bruised and a lot of wounded and a lot of very angry young women. And I suppose when I call myself a reactionary feminist, it's because I want to reclaim a defense of women. Mm-hmm. From those people who say that injuring yourself in that way is the feminist thing to do. And I want to reclaim women's interests, and I want to reclaim feminism from those who say that liberating yourself from your kid so you can go and put packets through a scanner is emancipating. And I want to say, no, actually, it's more complicated than that. And there are more pieces to this puzzle. And perhaps we need to ask some of these questions again, and ask whether more progress and more freedom and more stuff and more machinery and more technology is actually really doing any of us any good. Maybe it's time to back out of that blind alley a little way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I say it's long past time. I echo that sentiment heartily. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in the lives of the women of my generation and those coming up. I have a 17-year-old girl at home, and I want her obviously to have equal opportunities, but she knows where her true value lies. And you mentioned in particular the libertarian wing of the feminist lies that start talking about buying and selling your body as though you can commodify what it means to be a woman in that way. And I don't believe that has been freeing, exactly as you're saying. I also think it's important to define what it means to be to be a man, to be a woman beyond, I think, just the term traditional. That's something that you're seeing coming up as well. There's a whole host of influencers now that use the term trad wife. And that's something I'm not even sure I've heard a great definition of that. I don't know that if me doing this radio show means that I can't be a trad wife, if I have to be staying at home in an apron with bouffant hair making cookies all day. Like, is that the definition of trad wife? But I do believe that there are certain long held and long established definitions. And for me, as a Christian, I believe the biblical definition of man and wife is the one that brings forth the most happiness, because it's that which was instituted by God. But there's lots of cultural elements to those roles as well. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind addressing the faith component, because I know your book does as well, about how Christianity has influenced all of this, and how we might be able to, I don't think it's a coincidence that the further that we've removed ourselves from biblical understanding or Judeo-Christian morals or values or definitions in our society, the more confusion occurs in all of these other areas. As you said, I don't think it exists in a vacuum. I think it's all associated together. But I wonder if you wouldn't mind bringing in some of the faith component to our understanding and how that has changed.
Sure. I haven't addressed the shaping influence of Christianity on everything I've been talking about directly in the book, largely because I wanted to write a 55,000 word book rather than a 155,000 word book.
Fair enough.
And unfortunately, some of that just means sometimes you have to choose what to leave between the lines. But I actually think it's wildly underappreciated, really, by most feminists, just how far the women's movement, as in its entirety, including the liberal wing, perhaps especially the liberal wing, is structurally reliant on a basically Christian understanding of what people are and how men and women should relate to one another. And if you look back at historians' accounts of sexuality in the Roman era, in the pre-Christian era under Rome, under the Romans, there was no such thing as an understanding of men and women as equal and as it were, sanctifying one another in the sexual act within the institution of marriage. Sexuality wasn't really thought of even really in heteronormative terms. There was, if you'll pardon my language, there was the doer and the doee. In Roman times, and if you were the doer, you were considered a person. If you were and if you were considered a non-person, then you could be done at any time, and that included children, that included slaves, that included women, and that included subordinate men, and that was really how the Romans saw sexuality. And when you read the early church fathers, really very, very excoriating, very, I suppose, from a modern perspective, prudish discussions of sexuality, you have to understand that they're addressing the Romans. They're addressing a Roman culture which was libertine in a way which is increasingly comprehensible, really, when you look at the news today, but which was a long way from, well, it was very, very much more incredibly libertine and incredibly aggressive and incredibly, patriarchal in a way which is quite difficult to grasp now. And I think one of the things which is grossly underestimated by feminism is the extent to which Christianity actually made relations between men and women less patriarchal and more equal, in the sense of with more or less success, under specific cultural and material circumstances, doing its best. I think what we can say to negotiate between the different physiological and material needs of the sexes, given our distinct reproductive roles, and doing its best to kind of plot a line of best fit between our needs and interests. And if taken together, I'd say that the Christian sexual ethic is about the best possible. I can't think of a better one, to be honest. I can't think of a more coherent and humane and balanced, or a more cogent attempt to be balanced and humane and respecting the dignity of all the people involved. And certainly it's head and shoulders above what was going on under the Romans. And I think it's absolutely true, yes, as we've drifted away from Christianity, with an energetic, swinging of the hammer by a great many liberal feminists, doing their best to saw off the branch really that they're sitting on. What we're beginning to see emerging is something, frankly, a lot more Roman. in terms of a sexuality that really is unbounded, and a sexuality which doesn't respect the boundaries of the human person in the same way. And to be honest, a sexuality that doesn't really have a concept of the human person as such. I mean, I said the other day, and I've been thinking about it a lot since, because I think there's a lot more to say about it. The last round of religious warfare, which was precipitated by the printing press, was over our relationship to scripture. And the digital revolution, to my eye, it's an information revolution on a par with the printing press. Except I think instead of taking us all into literacy, it's taking us out of literacy again. When you think about the young people who just don't read and who engage on TikTok, and frankly, the political leaders now who don't read and who just engage on TikTok, I think increasingly what we're seeing is a post-literate civilization. And as a consequence of that, the religious argument we're having now is not over it's not over our relationship to writing, really, to scripture. It's over our relationship to our nature, to imago Dei. That's what the entire battle is about. Do we have a nature? Is there anything sacred about the form that humans take? Who gets to reproduce? What is marriage for? Who gets to marry? Who gets to have sex with whom and why? And what forms of sex are forbidden and why? And really, do we have the right? Do we have the entitlement to upgrade are our bodies sacred in the form that we have them, that we're given them? Or is this something we're entitled to upgrade as we see fit? Mm. And I think the more we exit the era of literacy, which was, I suppose, the era of mass adoption of a kind of scriptural consciousness, into this digital era, which is more of a disembodied relationship with information. You think of all of these kids who've grown up socializing in Minecraft, and what that must do to your beliefs about the relationship between mind and body. You think, well, it's no wonder that all of them just believe they can upgrade their meat suits like they can upgrade their avatars on Facebook or Twitter. I mean, I know the kids are not on Facebook and Twitter anymore, but you get what I'm saying.
We can talk about them on Facebook and Twitter.
We have some safe spaces, so that's something.
Well, or even that our bodies are holding us back. Right.
Or indeed, well, absolutely, that our bodies are holding us back. That's something you see quite a lot. One of the most jarring and startling phrases that you see cropping up fairly regularly, that really comes off the back of the discussion of abortion or an unplanned pregnancy as forced pregnancy. The idea that restrictions on the right to end a pregnancy is forcing somebody to have a pregnancy. And you think, well, that's a view, but there's also the option of not having sex. Yeah. But I think there's something very jarring about this rephrasing of what is fundamentally a natural, normal, physiological process as something which is an act of violence, effectively, because it's unchosen. And then you see that extended beyond unplanned pregnancies to puberty. And people talk about forced wrong puberty or forced puberty. And you think, hang on a minute. Are you seriously proposing to reframe a normal developmental organismic process as something which is an expressive option, that you can select from a menu of possible expressive options and you can switch on and off at will? Not only is that just actually medically way, way beyond what actually is available, but even if it were physically possible to just flip a switch and have the other puberty, which actually physiologically it isn't, what you get is a sort of horrible butchery and a kind of sterilized simulacrum of the opposite sex. But even if it were physiologically possible, basically what we're saying is that we're just entitled to remodel our bodies as we see fit. And fundamentally, the heart of that is the contest over imago Dei. Are we created? And what standing does that even have? What troubles me most deeply is that when I look at the forces that are arrayed, waging war now on the idea of imago Dei, on the idea of human nature, I see a deregulatory drive on a par with what happened in financial services in the 1980s and 1990s, and with to much the same purpose. If you can deregulate human nature, you can fiddle around with the human organism to potentially limitless commercial ends, potentially liberatory ones for a few extremely rich people who want tentacles grafted onto their butts or whatever. But pardon my...
I wish I could say that were impossible. I wish I could say I couldn't believe that.
You just know that somebody's going to go and do it. But there's a few cranks who might want to get, extra arms grafted on or whatever, and who have the money to actually go ahead and make that happen. But the real applications are human pig chimeras for the organ transplant industry and things like that, which you and I will find instinctively revolting, and actually most normal people in a still largely Christian heritage culture will find instinctively revolting, but would be potentially immensely profitable if we could just get people over the instinctive ick factor. And the only way we're going to get people over the ick factor is to make the basic accepted belief that humans have a nature completely low status. is just something which only deplorables believe. The moment that's been achieved, you're halfway to being able to commodify the human organism and turn us all into grey goo that can be sold and remodeled and bought and fiddled around with this way and that, to the limitless profit of the biotech industry and the endless woe of whoever it is who gets co-opted as the raw materials. I don't know. That's not a world I want to live in.
No.
And if that means some of the gains of, Judge Ketanji Brown have to be rolled back in the process, that's a price I'm honestly willing to pay.
Well, and what you are alluding to here is so critical. We often speak about the gender confusion and what we call around here the rainbow mafia, and it being a subject of this kind of radical autonomy, that you have to give me ultimate freedom so that I can redefine myself in any way possible. The flip side of that is the related oppression on others as well. It's not just about, one individual, an adult, preferably being able to restyle themselves however they like or refer to themselves with whatever language they choose. That has an assault inherent in it on objective truth, but we'll set that aside for the moment. There's also the oppressive aspect now where there is demanded affirmation, celebration, there's demanded recognition, redefinition, to the point where if there are no limits on what one can do to oneself, there are also no limits, since there's nothing sacred about humanity in general, there's no limits on what you can do with other people because they don't have any value either. There's no reason to protect vulnerable children from predation, from oppression. There's no reason to protect women against the abuse of men, even men who style themselves as women. There's no reason to have any sort of restrictions on using somebody else's body because that's what it's there for. I mean, we talked just briefly about surrogacy, and that's something that has been controversial to point out, but it is, I think, a dangerous game that we're playing to say that I can use somebody else, whether we're exchanging money or not, or whether I just desire to do that because there's nothing sacred about them as another human being. And we're devaluing ourselves with every step we take in that direction, not to mention, what we're doing to the preborn children, what we're doing to our elderly, because they're, not beneficial to society anymore in the broad sense. And I look at what we're doing to others. It makes perfect sense if we demolish our foundation that says every human is valuable. When you take that away, there is no reason not to oppress your power, your desires on somebody else just because you want it.
Absolutely. There are people now excitedly proclaiming how wonderful it will be for trans women once uterus transplants become medically possible. Well, hang on a minute. Where are these uteruses going to come from? It puts me in mind of a quote from Martine Rothblatt, who's a farmer multimillionaire and transgender activist, who says From Transgender to Transhuman, a manifesto for freedom of form, which is, if anybody wants to be waking in a cold sweat for several nights in a row, I suggest that as your bedtime reading. And Martine Rothblatt says, humanness is in the mind. And in Rothblatt's view, there is, the entirety of what makes us human is contained in our consciousness. And, at that point, at the point where, as the book imagines, we'll be able to upload ourselves to digital forms, then we'll be just as human as we would be before. And you think, well, okay, but if setting aside the 1,001 other objections that I have to that idea, if our humanness exists entirely in our consciousness, which can be theoretically separated from our embodiment, then our bodies really are just meat. They're just inert flesh that we can do as we want with. And that's all very well if you're Martine Rothblatt and you're a farmer multimillionaire. If you're right at the other end of the food chain and you're the woman who's renting her mouth or her anus or her uterus to make rent, it's the idea of being turned not just into the product but the workplace or even the raw resource, while you're still in your body, is truly the stuff of nightmares. And so once again, I think it's, unless we apply the lens of money and power to this as well, or rather, the moment we do apply the lens of money and power, we begin to see just the scale of the nightmare, which unfolds from what promises to be a truly liberatory and emancipatory way of looking at what it is to be a human. And you think, well, it might be liberatory for, I don't know, Elon Musk or Martine Rothblatt, but it's a whole other ballgame for the impoverished women in the global south who are being pressured into surrogacy by their skint families and then being ostracized from their villages when they come back. I think what looks like emancipation at one end of the food chain is something much more, is just profoundly horrifying at the other.
Well, on that note, Mary, where do you see hope?
Where
Look
do
at
I see
that.
hope?
Yes.
I see.
I don't want to
do I see
leave us
hope?
here. I would
No,
love
this
to see.
is a very bleak place to end. I see a lot of people asking questions. Well, I see women in particular saying, no, enough. This we've gone far enough.
Mhm.
I'm seeing people of both sexes, but really led by women, saying we have to draw a line, and we're humans, and we're not grey goo. You know, we're not just we can't just stick ourselves in a blender and come out a different shape according to how we feel that day. This is just a pernicious lie,
Mhm.
and it has obvious negative ramifications. You know, really not even very far down the track. Some of this stuff needs to be rolled back pronto. I mean, I really go back and forth on this, because sometimes I look out at this sort of totalitarian rollout of this stuff, and I think, well, is there even any way of stopping this? And I think, no, there's always hope. There's always hope. And I mean, it's we're in Holy Week now, and if you'll, and you think about the last moment, the darkest moment really of the Passion story, where Jesus is on the cross and he cries out right at the end, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And you think at that moment he thought everything was lost, but that wasn't the end of the story. You know, it wasn't the end of the story, and I think that's about where I feel we are with this stuff right now, as though we've driven spirit about as far as possible from flesh as it's possible to go, but I don't think that's the end of the story. I think we'll find our way back to the Word and the flesh together.
Oh, well, I greatly appreciate your willingness to dive into the depths of our depravity, how we got here, and what we might be able to do to make sense of moving forward. I think you're absolutely right, Mary. I think there is every reason to hope, because God is yet on the throne. He is not finished with us yet. His design is good. And the more that we just tell the truth in love, just as an average everyday Christian, as a woman who loves being a woman, who loves the way God has created me, to say, I see you as a man or a woman made in the image of God for a unique purpose. And that is a beautiful thing. That's a wonderful thing. And to be able to recognize the value in each and every person, to shine that example as being stunningly different than perhaps what the elites around us would tell us is valuable. We have to, I think, embody, to use today's word, embody the difference. Embody how our worldview impacts everything around us, impacts the way that we treat people, the way we see people, and the outgrowth of that, to do good works in his name, to let our testimony shine in that way. So just to make it very practical, you made a wonderful intellectual case for that. And I highly recommend the book Feminism Against Progress by Mary Harrington. And we can use that to equip ourselves to live out what we believe, which is so stunningly different than the norm, perhaps, and is eminently cancelable in today's culture. Ask me how I know. But it doesn't make it any less true. And it's been true throughout the ages. You are on the right side of history, to use another slogan, when we say men and women are different, are equal in value, are different in design. And that is all for a purpose. You are made for a purpose for this moment here and now. And let me introduce you to more about the God who made you. Like, those conversations can go in all sorts of wonderful, hope-filled directions that give us purpose and have given hope to societies throughout the ages. Now is our time, and we have to be equipped. I think we have to look evil in the face. We have to look the lies in the face in order to shine the truth with boldness, and that's what's required today. That's my 2 cents worth. But you should get the book by Mary Harrington, Feminism Against Progress. Mary, thank you for being generous with your time, with your wisdom, with your insights, and with your courage. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mary Harrington's book. I'll link to it in the show notes as well. So check out the podcast. If you're hearing this, no matter where you're hearing this, check us out online, Faith Works Live, where the millennials are on Facebook and millennials and beyond. But you can also find us on Instagram, everywhere that you get your podcasts. If you have been as challenged and as motivated by this conversation as I have, please share it with a friend, pass it on, so that we can all be equipped and gather together as people of good faith, people of common sense, maybe making common sense common again, that can really start to take back the ground in this culture that we've seeded through our silence, through our fear. We can't let fear reign anymore. No longer can we be silent about the good news, about the truth that is available, yes, even to this Romans 1 world. I do live in hope, but our challenge for us today is to not allow being nice to cause us to be silent. Lack of clarity is not loving. A lie is not loving. Love does not rejoice in evil, but love rejoices the truth. You've been listening to Faith Works Live. We have a mission, so let's be about it. When a woman faces an unplanned pregnancy, every possible emotion goes through her head. Where can she go for help and for hope? She can go to Intervisions. Here in our metro, we have 2 healthcare clinics where she will find hope and help. From free pregnancy testing and STD testing to free ultrasounds, Intervision serves women and men with STDs who find themselves in vulnerable situations. They're completely free of charge because of generous donations from folks like you. And their medical clinics help their patients get all the information that they deserve, that empowers them to make life-affirming decisions. That's what they do at Intervision's healthcare clinics right here in Des Moines. Learn more at intervisionshealthcare.org. That's intervisionshealthcare.org. And you can call 24 hours a day at 515-440-CARE. That's 515-440-2273. In today's world, security has never been more vital. And at FaithWorks Live, we're proud to partner with VeriGuard Security. It's a professional physical security service, and they're really raising the bar in security and private investigations. Whether you need a team of professional officers to protect what you have worked hard to build, or their mobile security units for multiple properties or large locations, from business or corporate properties to your home or neighborhood. Perhaps you've got an event coming up. They secure quality security coverage for events large and small, because it's about peace of mind and protecting you, your family, your team, and your property. Settle for nothing less than the best when it comes to your security. You shouldn't have to compromise. When it comes to security, you can trust VeriGuard. Contact them today at verigard.us. That's VARA guard.us. For security service, you can trust VeriGuard.